What do other meetings do?
Yeah, that's right.
Some elevator music.
As long as we don't charge, we can't get into trouble.
Okay, great. Good. So welcome everyone and Happy New Year. My name is Alvin Chin. I am the chair of ACM Chicago. Welcome to our meeting, which is a conversation with Ruby on Rails creator David Meyer Hansen, otherwise known as DHH. Thank you for coming today from all over the world, not just the USA, so it's really great to see this. And also welcome to ACM Chicago members as well as ACM members from other local chapters. So thank you all for joining us today. So good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you are. So this meeting conversation will be recorded. So you will get a copy of this recording after the end of the meeting. And I'd like to ask those who are not the speakers if you could mute yourself as well as turn off your camera. That would be appreciated. Thank you very much. So many of you here already are ACM members, so you don't need this. But for those who are new to this ACM meeting or so, ACM basically is a 501c3 society started back in 1947 when computers were job titles for humans. So if you remember, there was that Hidden Figures movie with Grace Hopper, considered the first programmer. And basically our purpose for ACM is to bring computing researchers, entrepreneurs, and practitioners together to address the computers field challenges. Okay, so what ACM does, you might have heard about the Turing Award that's awarded to recipients every year. So 2 years ago, the founders of deep learning, Jeff Hinton, and Yoshua Bengio, and forget the last one or so, but anyway, three of them, they got the Turing Award for their work in deep learning and neural networks. And also as well, ACM does publish original research, so papers and publications, and many events, so 170 major conferences yearly that can be attended, most of them now being done virtually. 850 chapters around the world, 38 special interest groups, and 15 meetups. So you can attend one of those meetups or chapters that are in your local region. Now for ACM Chicago, so we are the Chicago chapter of the ACM. Normally, of course, we do our meetups regularly, monthly, at the Loyola Water Tower campus in downtown Chicago. But obviously, since what happened from March last year, everything has been totally virtual. But we've got a lot of great response and a lot of people joining from all over the world. So that's really, really great to see that. So we have a lot of meetups. So apparently, like for example, we had a meetup or so in September with Ricardo Baez Yates. On bias on the web, and he is the ACM distinguished speaker. So we invite a lot of different speakers from industry, from academia, as well as distinguished speakers from the ACM. So we have a lot of meetings we had last year. They have been recorded. So after this particular meeting, I will send a link to our resources where you can see previous ACM Chicago talks, as well as the slides. And you can see our website here, chicagoacm.org, is where we post our previous as well as our next upcoming events. As well as you will see there that we have our Facebook page, we have Twitter, and we also have LinkedIn. So you can join those and be notified as to when our next events are. All right, so the reason why you're all here today. So we're very, very pleased to have with us here our speaker, who is David Heinemeier Hansson. And if you have done any stuff with Ruby on Rails, then he is the one who started it all, was the creator of Ruby on Rails and is the co-founder of Basecamp, which I'm sure now is very, very popular for remote work because now everybody is doing remote work since kind of last year, more than ever before. So He will be, he's our speaker, and we will have questions that will be directed towards him. And our moderator is Valerie Woolard. So she is a Heroku data infrastructure engineer, and as well as the ACM Local Mentoring Committee chair. And so without that, I will turn it over to Valerie. And if you have any other questions, you can, we had a lot of questions that came from our Zoom registration. So thank you for those questions. If there are any other further questions, you can type them in the chat. And if we got time, we can be able to go through them. So Valerie, you go ahead. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much for the intro. And thanks so much for joining us, David. I wanted to start off by talking a little bit about what are the tech things that are exciting to you right now?
Well, sir, first of all, thanks for having me. Chicago was my first home when I moved from Denmark back in 2005, right after getting involved with Web Basecamp and Ruby on Rails. So it's great to have that connection. Yes, what's exciting about web development right now? There's so much. I think that's the amazing thing. You look at the history of Ruby on Rails. I've been programming in Ruby since 2003, a good 18 years now. And I wake up more or less every day, super excited to continue to work in it. And a lot of it is, I love the web. The web is the most amazing software development platform the world has ever seen. And the fundamental principles of openness, lack of gatekeepers, smooth-ish on-ramps to learning how to use it remain as true today as they were when I first got involved with the web back in the 90s. But right now, I feel like what I'm especially excited about is kind of what's coming after this wave of JavaScript. We just went through the past 10 years of people essentially, I don't know, rediscovering JavaScript to some extent, where there has been a long phase of people simply just being annoyed by JavaScript to finally deciding to do something about it and make it better for web development. I think a lot of those changes that came from that, from the adoption of JavaScript and the push of JavaScript were really exciting. I think the fact that we suddenly got to write in like the future version of JavaScript before all the browsers had adopted them was really cool. But I also think, unfortunately, that we took a lot of blind steps along the way, and that what we ended up with and what is true for a lot of developers today is that developing for the web today is seriously complicated. And it's seriously complicated because the front end is seriously complicated. Just setting up your build pipelines and Webpack configs and up the wazoo you need to build so-called modern front end is really intimidating. And it's segregating in a way that didn't used to be true. In some circles, it almost feels like the notion of a full stack developer is either a curiosity, a joke, or somewhere in between, that you're not actually supposed to be able to do it all anymore, because who could? Who can become an expert in all of these things, right? And I think that is a statement of bankruptcy on our ability to simplify the stack in such a way that individuals can understand the whole thing and build web applications. What I've been working on for the past several years is a direct approach to trying to solve that. What can we learn for the past 10 years of JavaScript development and take the best of that without having to deal with these towers of complexity in such a way? So Hotwire, or HTML over the wire, is a technique to developing the front end that I've been working on for past few years with Sam Stevenson and Javan McMalley at Basecamp, and we just kind of pushed that out. So I'm really excited about that. I'm really excited about the reset that brings, which is just, that's a specific approach, a collection of frameworks and techniques. And then I'm really excited about the fact that browsers finally caught up to that future version of JavaScript that was promised to us in whatever 2012. And now you can run ES6 and have a modern modular system right in the browser. And I feel like that's a thing where we're still just squinting at it. We haven't fully realized what that means. There's techniques of using something called Skypack, where you essentially push your entire JavaScript bundling framework into the cloud and use it as a CDN. I think that's super interesting, super exciting. And then just all the things of, hey, what if we could just ship JavaScript directly as a single file to the browser, and we could write it in a modern version of JavaScript that didn't suck, and the browser would just understand it. And that kind of feels like we're just about there. All the pieces are now there, and I'm really excited about that. So it kind of pendulum swings back and forth. I care about the whole web stack, and for a long time I cared a lot about the back end. Now I feel like there's such an opportunity on the front end. Hotwire, in-browser ESM, ES6. We can finally kind of dump a lot of the shims, the bootstraps, the stuff we had to do to make JavaScript livable for the past few years. Now we don't need them anymore. All that scaffolding can be torn down. And if there's one thing I love more than anything else in software development, it's the leading lines of code. Code you no longer need. And not just even code, almost like conceptual models you no longer need. One of my favorite techniques or aspirations is this idea of conceptual compression. You take something that's really hard and that requires entire specialists to understand, like setting up your JavaScript pipeline, build pipeline, and you compress it all the way down until it can fit in as one slice out of many other slices into the brain of a single developer.
Mm-hmm. And what do you feel like the future of JavaScript development looks like in that world?
I hope it looks like essentially the present, but widely distributed. That we take this fact that you no longer need transpilers, you no longer need Babel, you no longer need CoffeeScript, which was the thing I was excited for a number of years, because the core language, ES6, now is so good that it's actually enjoyable to write in. It's not my favorite language in the world. I'm madly in love with Ruby even after all these years, and that's my favorite language in the world. But I don't mind JavaScript anymore, which is a huge step forward for how things used to be. And that I can get to use a great version of JavaScript without all the complexity that comes from build pipelines, I think is a huge step forward. So I'm really excited to see that kind of spread out. If you just take Rails, for example, Rails for several years now have shipped with Webpack built in. We've essentially said, you know what, we got to do it. We got to get the whole JavaScript pipeline in. We tried to make it as easy as possible, but it's still complicated and you still kind of have to understand it, especially when it breaks. What if that wasn't a necessity that everyone who's trying to build a Ruby on Rails application had to learn? What if we could take that part out and you only need to learn it maybe if you need to use React? What if you didn't use that? Could you start simpler? And can we make it less intimidating to become a web developer? I think that's one part I'm excited about it. There's similar things going on in CSS. CSS, I kind of lost touch with CSS, to be perfectly honest, over the years, because we have some great designers at Basecamp, and I thought, like, that's what they figure out, right? Tailwind CSS and these other utility-first frameworks that straddle somewhere in between Bootstrap, where it's not trying to design how everything looks, gives you enough power to it, but I don't have to be a CSS expert anymore to understand it. Super exciting again for me. I can now kind of imagine, you know what? If I had to build a whole thing myself, I could probably learn this. I could probably figure it out. And it's all these conceptual compressions about how to build great modern CSS, Tailwind, other approaches like that, utility-first CSS. The fact that ES6 is now in the browsers, we start using that. We start realizing that some of the things we've actually had for years have more power than we've given them credit for. HTTP2 is a great example. This whole idea that ES6 can have a moduling system that works in the browser and kind of whatever libraries you depend on or just pulled in ad hoc as they're needed is in large part enabled because HTTP2 lowers the cost dramatically of creating or requesting a new thing. You only have to do one SSL handshake. So all of a sudden, the difference between, oh, you have to bundle all your 20 JavaScript files into one file because if you had to do 20 requests, it would take too much time. It would be a bad user experience. Poof, it just disappears. There's no penalty to having your thing in 20 files versus one file. Bundling all of a sudden loses a lot of its appeal, not all of it, but most of it. And I think that's, it's all those things. The fact that we made a huge step forward in what can we do? but it was very hard to actually do it. Now we take all this, that huge leap of progress. What can we do? We can do all those things, but what if you didn't have to do all the work? That is the grail of, I think, any framework builder, and I'm a framework builder. I'm constantly looking at the applications I build. Can I build them simpler? Can I build them with less code? Can I forget things, right? When I talked about conceptual compression at one of the RailsCons, one of my examples was SQL, talking to a SQL database. You know what? If you put me on the spot in front of a whiteboard and made me write out the correct syntax for all the different SQL statements, even just the common ones, I'd probably struggle a little bit. Because you know what? I don't write a lot of SQL by hand anymore. Yeah, I could look it up. I could figure it out. But the fact that I've been able to compress that and make it a smaller part of what has to be in my working memory is wonderful. Can we do the same with these other things on the front end? I think we can. I think it's coming. And I think in 2 years, 3 years, we're going to look back and see, hopefully 2021 as this moment where like the waters parted and all of a sudden front end development was no longer like a profession as a thing just to know how to set it up and figure it out.
Right. Where, you know, at one point, maybe you needed a database expert to be able to construct SQL queries for you. Now you can have a Rails dev who can probably handle a lot of that. We might see more of that kind of evolution on the front end.
That's exactly it. And that's exactly it. I mean, I remember when I started working with the web, the DBA, the database administrator who set up the views, who made all these things, who optimized the queries, like that was a person. Now that person is liberated to do more things. I'm a huge fan of generalists. I'm a huge fan of generalism in general. That's why I'm focusing on integrated systems, that one developer is supposed to be able to understand the whole thing. Now, there are certain times where that doesn't work. If you're working at, I don't know, Facebook or even Shopify or other large organizations, you have to specialize. But for us to be able to get the next generation of those things, the next generation of Facebook, the next generation of Shopify, we have to have it in such a way that you can get started without needing a team of 12 specialists, right? Because that was one of the things that was so exciting to me about the web and so exciting to me about open source was it used to be that like, hey, you want to run a major website, hey, you got to buy some really expensive Oracle licenses. You got to buy some serious Sun hardware. I mean, this is, maybe I'm showing my age here. This is going all the way back to the 90s. But this was just, there was these gatekeepers, these barriers that were preventing people from doing it. And I grew up in the age of like, hey, we can just go on a shared host. We could just use the MySQL database. We get that for free. I don't need a DBA to figure it out. We can use the Apache web server as it was back then. We can use Ruby. We can use all these things. They don't cost anything. We can get going. And I mean, not to blow your employer's horn, but I think Heroku is another example of that, right? Before you used to be essentially a systems administrator. When we first launched Basecamp, I had to figure out Linux in a way that like I almost kind of prefer not to figure out Linux. I mean, I'm glad I did, but system administration is not my passion. I would much rather that we can conceptual compress that too, and someone can just do git push main origin, and boom, the app is running.
Yeah, absolutely. Another thing that you've talked a lot about, in addition to your technical work, has been that you're a big proponent of remote work. And is there anything that surprised you about the past year as more people and companies have adopted working from home?
Yes, so I've been working remotely for more than 20 years in all sorts of contexts. And for a long time, I took it so for granted that everyone understood how liberating that is to personal freedoms and who you can hire and talent and so forth. And then I at some point realized that wasn't distributed at all. So I wrote a whole book about it that was released 8 years ago called Remote Office Not Required. And then I thought the argument was settled and we all understood the power of remote work. Absolutely not. It has taken this pandemic to inflict the understanding that not only is remote work possible, that we've shut down all the excuses for why remote work can't work for your particular unique company. It can work for all companies because all companies are working remotely right now. There's not a single tech company today that does not have some form of remote work or have done some form of remote work. So the pandemic has been an absolutely horrible, terrible, no good, very bad thing for the world. But even within that, we can still pluck out things and say, you know what? Okay, it's been absolutely terrible, but something good came out of it. It gave us an experiment in remote work that taught a lot of people that remote work is possible, desirable, and part of the future. Doesn't mean it's all the future for all the people all the time, but it is undoubtedly more of the future for more of the people, more of the time after this epidemic is over. What has surprised me greatly, though, is that all these people who just went like, you can't do remote work, it doesn't work, you don't have the water cooler, you don't have the whiteboard, you don't have all these other bullshit excuses that people would parrot for years and years. All of a sudden, they have to work remotely, right? And they think they can just do it. All right, actually, we're just working remotely. All we have to do is set up Zoom calls from 9 in the morning till 5 in the afternoon. Boom, we're working remotely, right? No. I mean, it fascinates me how you can be so delusional to 1 second think, oh, remote work is impossible, to the next moment think, oh, I'm actually an expert in it. So that transition to me is a lot about like, how do you collaborate, which is also a thing I've thought about and worked on for a long time. And again, one of the positive aspects to draw out of it is this renewed focus on writing. Writing to me is the superpower of remote work. It's the superpower of collaboration. It's the currency of open source. It's all of these things that enables so much stuff to happen, and to educate people in the power of asynchronous communication, that not everything has to be a meeting. Certainly meetings should not be the first tool in your box of collaboration methods, has been good to see. I don't know if it's actually happening. I think a lot of people are stuck in way too many Zoom calls from early morning to late evening. But hopefully that's where we're going to get. And yeah, we'll see.
And is there anything that you've changed about the way that you view or that you say at Basecamp handle remote work in the past year?
One of the things that's reminded us about is that while remote work is a pillar of how we've structured Basecamp, it is literally heartbreaking not to be able to see people face to face. That remote work is in no way, shape, or form a replacement for the human interaction that happens in person. All the years we've done remote work at Basecamp, we have supplemented that with at least twice a year, everyone would meet up and just hang out for a week, recharge the human batteries, top off those human connections. And we have been prevented from doing so for over a year now, and it's painful, and we can see the effects of it. When people don't have that opportunity to connect in person, there's a tendency to reduce people to avatars, to handles, to git commits, to all these other things. And you really have to actively fight back against that, because it is a depressing way to work when everyone else is or can be seen perhaps as almost like an API call. Oh, I just need something from that person. Can you get that to me? And that's the whole transactional exchange that we have. You have to combat that. And in person, it happens automatically because humans know how to do that. Online, it takes a little more work. We've been writing about how to do that, but we've had to redouble those efforts at Basecamp, do more of it. And even as we do it, it's not as good. I cannot wait until we can have a proper meetup at Basecamp again, get all 50, 60 people together in a single location for a week and just enjoy each other's company. And I can hold that thought in my head while being ever so thankful that remote work is a thing, and I'll continue to do remote work after that. And right now I'm sitting here in beautiful Spain and working with my colleagues in Chicago and Los Angeles and around the world. And that's wonderful, but yeah, humans need humans.
And shifting into talking a little bit about Rails, can you tell us a little bit, this is a question from Alvin, what made you create Ruby on Rails?
Yes, the short story is I fell in love with Ruby, the programming language, when back in 2000, it might actually have been in ACM magazine, either Dave Thomas or Martin Fowler. Both of them used to write in both the ACM magazine and IEEE magazine about various programming techniques, and they would use Ruby to explain those techniques. And I just saw that after having worked with with PHP and with Java, and just thought, oh wow, this is a unique, beautiful programming. It almost doesn't even look like a programming language. It looks like pseudocode. It looks like just sort of what you would pencil out when you would describe how something works. This is actually executable. Wow, that's amazing. And then I sort of started learning more about it. I had this opportunity to write a project in Ruby because no one was telling me what technology to use, and that project happened to be Basecamp. And it took exactly 2 weeks for me to have just that galaxy brain explosion epiphany moment with Ruby, where I was like, hey, I've been doing web development for several years now. This is something else. This is just a whole new wormhole of learning, excitement, and whatever. And once I fell down that, I built my own stuff with it, and I ended up building Basecamp with it. And after that, I felt like, you know what? Ruby cannot stay a secret. This is a crime against programming humanity, that Ruby is this exotic language out of Japan that barely anyone in the West knows about. And when they know about it, it's because Dave Thomas or Martin Fowler or someone like that does a pseudocode write-up in it. No, people need to be writing real systems in this. This needs to be something that people can do as a job. So I got really inspired about that. I had built a bunch of tooling because I needed to. Ruby didn't come with very much tooling for web development when I picked it up. And I thought, you know what? I can help. I can help get Ruby to more people if I take some of the tools I needed to build Basecamp and get others to use it, and they will see. I mean, that's the thing about selling Ruby on Rails, doing marketing for Ruby on Rails. A lot of it is just like, if I can just get a programmer to sit down and write some Ruby, for a large number of people, that'll convince them by itself. You don't almost need that much, just show the code. So that was what I focused on, particularly in the early days. I did that infamous 15-minute how to create a blog video back in the day, where just show the code, because the code will sell it. Do the before or after. I did a lot of contrast code with Java, and it always looked grotesque how much Java you had to write compared to how much Ruby you had to write. So that was how I got into it, that I fell in love with Ruby. I felt it was like a crime against programming humanity, that there weren't more Ruby programmers, and I set about trying to change that, and I still am. I mean, Ruby has gone through its phases of ups and downs in popularity. I don't think we're exactly at a high watermark right now, but these things they're pendulums, and they swing back and forth. And I think we're coming back from the JavaScript all the things all the time pendulum swing, and I want to make sure that Ruby is there looking as fit as ever for someone to give it a second look and realize, hey, actually server-side rendering is pretty cool. Even the React people are saying that now. Maybe I should give a programming language like Ruby a try.
And what do you think of the new Ruby 3 features and how those fit into Rails?
So one of the things that's so interesting about Ruby is that I've been head over heels in love with Ruby for 20 years. And the things that I ended up caring about in Ruby are not the things I think most people care about. A lot of people are very focused still about like how fast is Ruby, right? The whole mission for Ruby 3 was that it was going to be 3 times as fast as Ruby 2. And I think back on like 2003 when I adopted Ruby, and think about like how much computing power you could buy for $1,000. How slow Ruby was when I picked it up. I think it was 1.6.8 was the version that we ran it on, like way more than 3 times slower than 3 is now. And it was fast enough, right? It could do all the things I wanted to do with it. It wasn't an impediment. So while I'm excited for it, I always love free speed. Who doesn't love free speed? It means you pay less for your hosting bills and all these other things. It's a nice to have, and it has been for a long time. And the things that enable that kind of speed, like Raptors and these other advances, they're system levels programming that I hope someone who's really good at that stuff and care about that stuff will build into the Puma web server or something else that I use in such a way that I actually never have to know, right? That's the thing I feel about concurrency. The less I actually ever have to think about it, if I can think of my entire program as just a procedural thing that executes one line at a time, and there's no threading I have to worry about, there's no jumping back and forth I have to worry about, the better it is. And that's kind of what I get excited about. So in many ways, it sounds wrong, but it doesn't change my day-to-day very much, right?
Yeah,
The-
I mean,
the
I think it goes
extra
into the conceptual compression that you were talking about earlier, that like the less you have to think about, the better.
Exactly. And the less I have to think about systems programming, the better. I mean, I barely know my way around a C program. I am ever so grateful for the C programmers who exist to create the Ruby language, because that's the level I like to play at. I like to wrestle with domain models. I like to name business models in my software. I like to massage APIs so they're ever. The low level stuff of like, how can I make the garbage collector run faster? I am ever so grateful that there are people who care about that, and I will cheer them on. It doesn't have my interest. The other thing I'd say is that Ruby is a really special and unique language because it allows anyone who uses the language to be a language designer on par with the original language designer. Maps enabled me to design my own Ruby to my liking, my own dialect, and in Rails we call that active support, where I've baked in all these things and it looks like it's part of the Ruby language. You can barely tell where the Ruby language begins and where active record begins. And that has enabled me, since I picked up Ruby, to make the best Ruby for me. So when Matt comes out with new improvements, or the people who are working on Ruby, it's like, hey, it's nice to have, but I think that the last thing I was like, truly, wow, this really changes things for me, was probably keyword arguments, which we saw back in like Ruby 2.2 or something like that. So anyway, ever grateful for all the progress that goes into it. Always grateful for free speed. Not something I worry about sort of all the time. I just love playing with the Ruby I can create myself.
Absolutely. Then we've got a question from Ayush from London, who asks, the future of JS and CSS bundling in Rails going? Do you see a return to sprockets or something like Snowpack?
Yes, it goes directly to what I'm excited about right now. I'm really excited about that question, and I don't fully have the answer. That's why I'm even more excited, because this is where you're just at the cusp of the technology frontier, and you're like, actually, could we do entirely without bundling? Could ES6 with ESM modules in the browser do the whole thing? What if we didn't need bundling at all? What if we don't need transpiling at all? This is super duper exciting, and I don't have the answer fully yet. I have a squint, I have a hint, I have a bet, and my bet is that we can do away with a lot of these things for a lot of people for a lot of the time. So my working thesis right now is that Rails 7 does not need to have Webpack turned on by default when you start a new application. It needs to be there because there's a bunch of things only it gives you access to. React is one of the main things, and other front-end libraries like that. I'm not a big React person. I'm not a big Vue person. I like to write my stuff in a different way. I would love to be able to do that. I would love to be able to write Hotwire without needing Webpack and all the complexity that goes with that. And just one simple example of that. You type Rails new my blog and you hit return today. We will run a whole script where it generates all the Rails code, and then we'll run like npm install on a few things. And I think about 18,000 files end up in your node_modules thing before you've done anything. Before you've done anything, we've installed 18,000 files on your file system for this one app. That's just the skeleton. And I'm just going like, do you know what? I think we took a wrong turn somewhere. How did I end up with 18,000 files in the check-in luggage for my new application? So I would very much like to see there be a choice again, because it felt like for a while there wasn't. That if you wanted to write a modern web application, you just needed to eat it. You just needed to use Webpack or something like it, and you needed to use the whole thing. And now there is a chance that we can return to something like Sprocket. So Hotwire itself is kind of jumping out on this. Turbo, which is the successor to TurboLinks and part of this Hotwire module, comes in a form together with Stimulus that you can use with the asset pipeline again, where you just use ES6, no transpiling, you just use ESM, means there's no bundling. It's so much fucking simpler. First of all, you write Rails new my blog, and like the script is done in like 2 seconds versus whatever the 25 seconds it takes to create all the 18,000 files and so on. So I think it's possible. I'm not 100% sure yet. We need to validate this. And I hope to do that over the coming months. And then hopefully by the time Rails 7 ships, we can have an answer. Is this a new good path? Will this work for most of the people most of the time when they're first starting out? And can we then make a nice, smooth, soft transition to someone who wants to go to Webpack when they need to, with no discrimination. You should be able to write all the React you want if you want to do that with a Rails app. Whether I'm a big fan or not does not matter. Rails is a very large tent. We don't need to all have the same preferences and the same approaches to things to collaborate. And that needs to continue, and that needs to be true. But yeah, very excited of resetting all this complexity.
And if you were to start Basecamp today, this is a question from Michael. If you were to start Basecamp today and wanted a UX that rivaled Asana and Notion, would you use Hotwire, or would there be any pieces better suited for React, Vue, et cetera?
100% of you use Hotwire. By the way, I mean, I'd like to dispute the premise of the question, as though, I mean, I've used Asana, I've used Notion. I feel Basecamp gives up nothing in terms of fidelity to that. And even more so, the most recent application I just released, which is an email system called Hey, gives up nothing to that. And Hey, which is at hey.com, ships with 40 kilobytes of JavaScript. And it's an email client. I mean, email clients for the longest time was almost a banner case for when you need client-side JS. And if you look at something like Gmail, I think they ship 1.6 megabytes worth of JavaScript to be able to make that thing happen. We ship 40K, and we ship 40K because we use Hotwire. Hotwire is absolutely a viable, strong, and in my opinion, preferable, faster, all these other things for a huge swath of applications. Not all of them. There are cases where you have extremely heavy fidelity needs on the front end where you need it. We wrote an entire text editor. It's called Trix, trix-editor.org, that we use at Basecamp. That's written in essentially client-side JavaScript. It's all happening on the client. It's required a lot of work. That was a great case for that. You wouldn't write a text editor in Hotwire. That doesn't make any sense. But you can then use it in the Hotwire app. So yes, Hotwire is, for me now, the default answer, my default recommendation for anyone starting a new information technology app that smells more like GitHub or Basecamp or Shopify than it does like Figma. Okay, if you're building Figma or Photoshop or something else online, you need something else. But if you're building a thing that smells more like Basecamp or Stripe or Zendesk or Hey or any of these other apps, absolutely my premier recommendation would be Hotwire. And of course I'd say that. I mean, I just spent 2 years building it. So I'd be like, yeah, don't use the shit I just spent 2 years building, use this React stuff instead. I wouldn't have wasted my time building it.
And I think as we think more about reducing the amount of work that the clients have to do, one of the main beneficiaries of that are, say, people who don't have as strong of internet infrastructure in other parts of the world where internet bandwidth is not as freely available. Was that a consideration of yours at all when you're thinking about these problems?
Yes, and I think that is sometimes some of these trade-offs. I think for a lot of cases, people just assume, okay, if I build a client-side JavaScript thing, it's going to be better. It's absolutely not a definitive notion. These things still have to communicate back and forth. There's a lot of, the whole reason the React team, in part, is excited about server-side rendered React components is because when you are rendering your template on the server, your distance to talking to the database is very, very short. If you have to put that distance over a network call, it's very long. Now, there are other benefits sometimes to client-side when you have a flaky or slow internet connection where you can fake some things for certain time. But I mean, ultimately, you have to commit things to a database. At least if that's what you're building, a database-backed application, which is what most people are building most of the time. And the other thing is, hey, if you're shipping 1.6 megabytes worth of JavaScript, yeah, maybe that's not that great if you're in a spotty 3G in Sahara or whatever, right? That doesn't mean that Hotwire has all the answers. One of the things I'm really excited about pairing with Hotwire, and that we've already started doing, is service workers. This idea that you can essentially enable things to work offline. We build our mobile apps around a service worker-ish idea, where so you have your emails when you're on a plane or whatever on your phone, even though Hey is a web app. So I think service workers is a big part of the answer to this. I hope also to make service workers easier, actually. Service workers are devilishly complicated, and they're very easy to get wrong, and you can end up putting the user in a screwed place where reload doesn't even work. So it's one of those chainsaws were like, hey, really powerful, but you can cut your arm off if you're not careful. So hopefully that gets easier, but yes, not a clear verdict either way. I'd say the traditional conventional wisdom that client-side JavaScript apps are better at this case, I think is bunk. Doesn't mean there aren't cases where it can be, just mean that like as a default thing, absolutely not.
And Nico asked, what do you think a developer needs to have in their working memory to be an effective web developer or a developer in general?
Well, this is going to sound self-promotional, but I mean, this is the life's work I have. Hopefully, Ruby on Rails, right? The whole ethos of Ruby on Rails is everything you need to build great applications. It's not technically true in all circumstances for all cases, but it should give you most of the things most of the time. And what does that mean, right? It means for most people, you need a database. I've been a big fan of relational databases for a long time. The whole NoSQL thing, I think it has its cases, but I think we took a blind alley there and we threw away most of the baby that was in the relational databases and how easy and secure they are not secure, can be hacked, but how easy they are to reason about, how hard to some extent they are to get wrong, how strong the tooling is, how much they actually fit the modeling that we do. We've talked for decades about the object relational impedance mismatch. Well, I'm like, I don't see that. I like this way of doing it. I have worked with object databases where you persist just an object, did not prefer. I felt like you often ended up in more trouble where it was harder to reason about this idea that the database has a schema. Not something I have a problem with. Again, there are exceptions and so on and so forth, but big fan of the relational database without actually being a big fan of a particular relational database. It's funny. Oftentimes I get this question, what do you think about Postgres? Right? I happen to have used MySQL for 2 decades. And I'm like, I don't think about it very much at all because I just don't care. So that to me is a sign of success, that relational databases are so boring and they're so good that in some sense, it doesn't even matter which one you use, right? Like, hey, if I need to use Postgres to push something to Heroku, okay, fine, I don't care. If we use MySQL at Basecamp, also fine, I don't really care. That to me is a sign of conceptual compression to such an extent that it's like, I don't have to worry about it all the time. This is a feature, not a bug. I can hide it behind active record 99.9% of the time. In fact, for Hey, our new email service, we don't have a single SQL statement written out in its totality, right? People think about, oh, sometimes you need to drop down to SQL. I'm sure you do, and I'm sure there's some cases. We just wrote a whole freaking email system that's used by a whole lot of people, not a single complete SQL statement in mind. So you got to figure out how to talk to a database. It's good to learn SQL. I think it's a nice level up. You don't need to. You don't need to know all about relational theory and cardinality and blah, blah, blah. Hey, start with active records. Start with that as the conceptual compressor for it. Then dive into it when you need it. Other thing I've been added to my toolbox in, let's say, the last 10-ish years, Redis. Redis is amazing for all sorts of things. All this ephemeral data where persisting in the database feels slightly off or wrong, Redis. The idea that you can have caches that have a lifetime and it figures out how to do cleanup by itself, conceptual compression, Redis, wonderful. What else? I think that's about it, right? You pick it, not even pick. You use a database, you use something like Redis, you use Ruby on Rails, get going, get started.
And this is a question from Dave. What are your favorite bloggers and websites to keep up with changes in web technology?
You know what? One of the things I miss these days is that bloggers are no longer what bloggers were. A lot of the blogging, including, sadly, depressingly, my own, has moved into fragments and they flow by in the ether on Twitter. And I think it's a major setback for the way we learn as an industry, this thing that everything, so many discussions are ephemeral and they just disappear. I wish I was blogging more. I wish there were more technical bloggers I would link to. And then the other thing is that for the blogs that I then do find, again, it's almost like a guilty admission. I do find a lot of them through Hacker News, even though I despise Hacker News's comment section with a passion a whole lot of the time. it is a way to find these things. I don't actually have like, do I have like bloggers I go to every day? I don't. I find technical articles through these methods. It is through Twitter. It is through stuff like Hacker News. I don't think it's good. I wish we would return to more stable blogging. I wish I would return to more stable blogging. We're getting some of it actually. It's funny. We talk about like blogging, right? Like we're getting essentially blogging 2.0. They're called newsletters, which is just ironic since email's even older than weblogs in the first place, but now they're essentially blogging, right? So I do subscribe to a bunch of newsletters. None of them are actually directly technical though. I don't know. Part of it is I pick these things up as I read them. It doesn't mean that that's a good prescription for everyone. Part of it is because I've been in this milieu for 20 years and I work with things in this way that isn't the main way I pick things up. In fact, when I want to sort of re-energize myself on a technical level, I go back to my classics. And my classics are a series of books, Patterns of Enterprise Application Architecture by Martin Fowler is one of my all-time favorites. Half of Rails is essentially just copy-pasting the patterns out of that book and re-implementing them in Ruby. Smalltalk Best Practices by Kent Beck is my absolute favorite hands-on practical book about how to write good code of all time. So I've read those books several times. And then, to be fair, sometimes when I want to learn about something new, like Docker was an example. I did a deep dive on Docker several months ago. I got a book from Manning on this. Unfortunately, I don't remember the author. It's a great book. I've done the same on AWS. I've done the same on other technologies like that, where sometimes it's fine to find a blog, and sometimes books are actually great because they collect all the things from blogs in one digestible thing. You can buy once, and then you have 250 pages to do something about it. So yeah, it's kind of like wishful. I wish there were more blogs. I don't read a lot of them. Hopefully that's going to change. A lot of things are changing these days.
Do you have any favorite Twitter follows or newsletters to recommend?
Yes, again, they're not mostly technical. One of the things that I was really happy to build into Hey was this feature called the feed, to give it a place where I could actually read those newsletters, because when I was using Gmail, I would get like 60 emails every day. They would all come into my inbox. They would all smash together with all the other emails I had that I had marked unread because I wanted to respond to them. And newsletters, I ended up never reading them because it was just, I'm just going to delete it because I have all those other shit. I'm a big fan of, I'm just going to throw shit out, which is just things I follow, not particularly necessarily technical, but I think it's good for technical people to follow. Matt Levine, who writes the best newsletter called Money Stuff on everything investment. It actually intersects with tech quite a lot because a lot of stuff he covers is tech IPOs and tech financing and so forth. Casey Newton, who's a journalist that used to work at The Verge, has his own newsletter called Platformer. I am a big fan of that. Bob Lefsetz, who's a music writer who also, everything is, I mean, software is eating the world, right? So software is also in music, and how do we deal with the platforms and Spotify and all these other things. He's great for that. I follow Matt Taibbi and Glenn Greenwald, who again, traditionally sort of all about anti-war and all these other things, are also now talking about tech because everyone is talking about tech all the time because platforms and the powers and monopolies are all up in that. So that's some throwaways in that. On Twitter, it's actually very easy to see. I don't follow that many people on Twitter. So you can actually just look at my list. If you go to my twitter.com/DHH, I follow 153 people. So it's a pretty easy list to read. And most of the people on that list are people I would actually recommend. There's not a lot of, I don't know, I was going to say fluff. That's not fair. I mean, I follow some people just because I'm interested in them, but most of the stuff I follow is about tech. It's about our industry. It's about sort of the world in this case. So if you just browse through, it's literally a permanent link, which I love. Twitter.com/DHH/following. You'll get 153 recommendations for who I think you should follow. I'll add one recommendation to that, which is the combination of those two things. I love newsletters. I love some thinkers on Twitter. I don't love Twitter as a thing in my life. It's a great source of anxiety and doom scrolling and whatever. But you can take some of the best things from Twitter and you can put them into a newsletter. And there's a great app for that called Mail.Brew, which allows you to essentially follow people on Twitter, but get their tweets in a newsletter. And you can get them like once a day or once a week. And it's a great way to follow someone, particularly if they don't tweet a lot, And if you really want to follow, I do that with several people as well.
Great. And we're getting to our last couple minutes here. So I'm going to leave it kind of open for you if you have any closing thoughts, and also to tell us about what we've seen a lot of change in the world over this past year. And I'm wondering what you're most excited for in the coming year.
So I'm most excited for this pandemic to fucking end. I'm really excited about vaccines rolling out. I'm living in Denmark now, and I think my slot is like May, I think, in terms of my age bracket for when they are going to roll that out. Super duper excited for that. Hopefully the fucking thing doesn't mutate and we have to start all over. I shouldn't even say that. I shouldn't jinx it. I'm hoping for 2021 to be a calmer year in all regards. We're not off to a good start. We're off to a shitty start. It's almost like it's picked up. I hope this is a aberration we're about to return to. So that's what I'm really excited about. I'm really excited about working on more stuff in tech, working on some of these ideas we talked about. I got Hey for Work coming out any day now, where people can use Hey for their business. We're working on Basecamp 4 this year, which, I mean, I've literally worked on Basecamp for 18 years. We've done 3 versions. So whenever we do a major new version, it's kind of a big deal. I'm excited to use a lot of these techniques that we've been developing on something again. And I'm excited to continue to do this, the work is pushing back Hotwire. We just launched Hotwire in late December. It feels like it's very early on in that. A lot more stuff to do there, much more stuff to push. Continue to just work on these things and getting everything simpler. How can we make Rails even of a simpler curve? I feel like it's been our mission all along. I don't feel like we've always hit the mark. This whole thing with Webpacker versus CSM, as we talked about at length, is a good example of that. Can we make Rails simpler? Can it require less of someone to come into the tech industry? I think is a really inspiring, important thing to work on. And the corollary to that usually always is, if you make it simpler for someone new to figure it out, you make it simpler for everyone. Everyone wants it simpler. I want it simpler. I can't remember everything that's even in Rails. Like every other day, I'm like writing something out. I was like, shit, didn't we do something in Rails? And then, oh, fuck, that's a thing that exists. And now I can delete 20 lines of code here. We make it better for everyone when we make it better for beginners. Can we do a conference this year too? That would be great. Like maybe the fall.
I'd love to go to a conference.
I don't know. I would like to go to a conference again. Which is funny because for a long time I almost stopped going to conferences. I got enough of them, and now I'm craving the human interaction that comes from that. That's it on the technical front. I think what I'm excited about.
And when is the next Rails version coming out?
So haven't fully figured this out. Usually whenever we put out a proclamation, like we're off by however much, I would like for the next version of Rails to come out at RailsConf, which is kind of a tradition. We try to target RailsConf as a moment of release. I would like if that next version of Rails was something like Rails 7. I would like if we have validated whether Webpack can be added as a sidecar rather than part of the main thing. There's a lot of things I'd like. I don't know if it's going to happen. I'm excited about a bunch of other things we're going to put into Rails. It's not just about the front end. We've done a lot of work on privacy with Hey, encryption, making it easier to encrypt on a per row basis in flight with Active Record. It's a surprisingly difficult problem, and we spent a lot of time figuring that out for Hey, such that even if our databases should be breached, no one would kind of have their emails revealed, and we can't even see their emails in the normal operating business. I'd like that was a default, that we, as a whole industry, just like leveled up and went like, hey, do you know what? Customer data, that's not something anyone should be able to look at just because they have console access. You shouldn't just be able to find anything you want without anyone knowing, without going through a decryption scheme. I think there's a bunch of stuff there we can do to level up. We've done some really interesting work around logging. Logging was one of those things for a long time. Oh, let's just do a full request log everything, log every line. And if that turns out to be too much data, I don't know, you figure it out, right? A structured logging is the response to that. It's a way of treating logging as a database almost, rather than a bunch of strings that you grep through. So that's something we've done a bunch of work on. I'd like to see that in Rails 7 as well. And then this continued effort of having all these big benefactors we have in the Rails world, like GitHub, like Shopify, continue to take the extractions from their wild web scale and give it to the rest of us. I mean, we've started using things at Basecamp like multiple database support that Eileen at GitHub had been eminent in extracting and getting onto the fact that both Shopify and GitHub are running now on the latest version of Rails. They're running on Rails Edge most of the time. It's freaking amazing. So I'm looking forward to what's coming out of those organizations. And as always, everyone who contributes to it. I mean, I'm always astounded. I keep thinking like, all right, now we've reached like people, Rails must do what most people want. No, the last release of Rails, I think 700 people contributed code to it. Whew, isn't that wonderful?
That's incredible.
So can't wait to see that. Yeah.
Well, great. I think we're just about out of time. So I'm going to turn it back over to, I think Alvin's going to be stepping in.
Yes, great. So thank you very much, David Heinemeier Hansson, DHH, and thank you, Valerie, for moderating this wonderful, awesome chat. I guess, we could keep going on and on, but want to be respectful of people's time because we're all busy, right, at home with different things to do. So thank you, both of you, for doing this chat today.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me. Thanks, Valerie.
And before, a lot of fun. Great. And before we end, I'm going to put a poll up here. So we want to know from our attendees today, how did you learn of this meeting? So you should see it on your screen. And while that is happening, we're going to announce what our next upcoming events at ACM Chicago. So let me just share my screen here. Okay. Okay, can everyone see my screen there?
No.
Okay, great. So I'm going to ask our vice chair, who is Mark Temp.
I'm not seeing the screen share yet.
No.
Me either.
Did Alvin just drop off?
Yeah, I think so. All right, well, I can tell you about, can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Loud and clear.
Okay, great. So our next two, so the great thing about our ACM local, like many locals, is that if you stick with us, and I know there's a lot of new people today, that we're like a variety show. We have different topics every month. As long as there's a computer in it, we'll talk about it, just like today's talk. So we have two exciting talks I'd like to mention briefly. So next month, machine learning, massive parallelism, big data, GPUs, loans, and your credit. Next week, 1 week from today, Wednesday, January 20th, 2021 at our normal time, 6 p.m. Central Time, the Chicago ACM is going to present Dr. Mark Bennett of NVIDIA with explaining and accelerating machine learning for finance. So when you come to this talk, you will learn how financial modelers can now use advanced GPU computer architectures with a Python-based framework, Rapids, to completely analyze millions of loans within seconds rather than minutes. So the talk will show how GPU acceleration allows for easy, cost-effective, and understandable application of advanced data models. Our speaker, Mark Bennett, is a popular repeat Chicago ACM speaker who has also appeared at the annual NVIDIA conference. We first met Mark when he attended our very first GPU computing talk in 2008. And since then, he has presented several computational finance topics. So make sure to attend this meeting so that you can get up to speed on this combination of hot topics. So I don't know if we have the slides yet, but you'll be able to see them, see this if you go to our meetup page. In February, both Mark and the following speaker is someone I both met around the same time about 10 years ago. Jeff Sullen is one of the inspirational teachers. If you saw our cinematic scientific visualization presentation late last year, he taught, he was the teacher, influencing teacher of that speaker. Digital Fabrication and Art, Computer Science and Public Schools Pair 3D Printing. So if you come to our February 17th, 2021 talk at 6 p.m., you're going to hear a true master teacher explain how he coordinated 150 Lane Tech High School students to create the digital City of Chicago 3D map, which is a 3D map of the 77 community areas that make up the City of Chicago, created by the Lane Tech Maker Lab. If you're unfamiliar with Lane Tech has produced more PhDs than any other public high school in the United States, period. Our speaker, Jeff Solon, has appeared on NPR, WGN News, has written for Make Magazine and books, and has worked with groups from Argonne National Laboratories to the Chicago Cubs. So sign up now for these upcoming events. You can go to our meetup page, and we'd be really happy to see you attend these meetings. Thanks for listening. So I don't know if Alvin has come back.
I'm back now. So one of my wishes for 2021 is better internet access.
So why don't you show those? Why don't you show those wonderful slides? If you can share your screen.
Yeah.
I have a brief announcement, if I may.
Yeah, who's this?
This is Edward Friedman. I'm chair of the ACM Greater Boston ACM chapter.
Okay.
I thought folks might be interested. We have a Zoom webinar tomorrow night at 7 p.m. Eastern Time. The topic will be the gene content of the SARS-CoV-2 gene, COVID genome, mutations in COVID that were determined by comparing 44 different separate sarbecovirus genomes. Our speakers are Manolis Kellis, who is a noted professor of computer science and bioinformatician at MIT and the Broad Institute at MIT and Harvard, and one of his PhD lab members, Erwin Gengris. So you can read about that. I won't read you all the details. You can find that on our website at meetup.com/ACM-Boston. That's tomorrow night at tomorrow the 14th at 7 p.m. Eastern. And then a week from tomorrow night, we have a very different webinar about computer and human interaction and usability in coordination with the Boston Chi, which is their name for their local SIG-Chi chapter of the ACM. So that's also on the meetup site. And the speaker for that is Jared Spool, who is a very well-known, high-profile researcher, writer, consultant, entrepreneur in usability and user experience engineering. So a couple good things in the next one day and a week from tomorrow on that website. We look forward to seeing people sign up. Again, it's a Zoom virtual event.
Thank you.
Sure. I see a question. No, the Boston is not 100% event. It's not 100% full. You go to Zoom to register, not through Meetup. The Meetup is sort of locked at the two organizers or two of our people who post on that site. Go to Zoom, and I think you'll find we have a capacity of 500, and we're nowhere near that yet.
Well, thanks everyone who's still here. Looks like we weren't able to get those slides up, but you can check our meetup site for those next two meetings that Mark just talked about.
Hi, Mark. Yeah, if you could share, if you want to share our upcoming, I'm not sure because I dropped on the call, so I couldn't seem to get back in. So there are still folks still here in the room.
Okay, so if you can see my screen right now. Oh, that's my dog, old long gone dog. But so here's our announcement for next month. There's Mark Bennett, again explaining accelerating machine learning for finance. Mark again is truly he's got a doctorate, but he's one of the most accessible speakers we've ever had. Don't let the degree scare you away. And then Jeff Solon. This guy is one of the most inspirational persons I've ever met. I met him when we were recruiting audience members like we do for a presentation at a PBS station, which was near his high school at the time. And I was totally amazed by him. He had left a number of major jobs in the San Francisco Bay Area because he wanted to change the way computer science education was taught in the public schools. And you can see on the right, there's part of the map that he will be talking about. And this was all done by 3D printing with various tools by his high school students. And of course, his high school students go to a very special school in Chicago, again, that has produced more PhDs than any other school in the United States. So I hope to see all of you attend these presentations. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Mark, and yeah, thanks all for joining today. Great chat with DHH. So thanks all. Stay healthy and safe, and hope to see you at one of the next events coming up. And if you have any other suggestions for speakers, possible speakers for the remaining of this year, we are setting up our schedule for the rest of the year. So if you have any recommendations of good particular speakers and topics for ACM Chicago, or you yourself want to be a speaker, please email us. So you can email me, chair@chicagoacm.org. And I'll just type that in the chat here. So if you have any suggestions for speakers. Okay, so with that, I think we'll close it. So thanks all for coming.